The stage lights in Chicago that night were so blinding they made my eyes sting, and the applause from thousands felt like a tidal wave crashing over me, honoring 10 years of my blood, sweat, and tears. At 37, I was standing at the absolute peak of my career, clutching that prestigious trophy to my chest. But just as I allowed myself to soak in the moment, Daniel, the perfect fiancé I had spent years worshiping, stepped toward me. He didn't pull me into an embrace. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive red wine on his breath brushing against my ear, and whispered with pure, unfiltered contempt, "Stop performing, Patricia. You're just begging for attention in the cheapest way possible." In that heartbeat, my entire world collapsed. The trophy in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as lead. Amidst the cheers of the entire city, the man I called my future husband chose that exact moment to drive a dagger into my self-esteem. I kept smiling for the cameras, but my heart turned to ice. I realized then that Daniel didn't love me. He wanted a trophy wife who could bring in the millions, but only if she kept her head bowed. But Daniel made a fatal mistake. He thought he could shrink me, but in reality, he had just lit the fuse on a time bomb. You won't believe what happens next, from a marriage contract laced with traps to a secret alliance of women he once looked down upon, and the cold, calculated way I used his own greed to land him right in the crosshairs of the SEC. Don't turn away, because the twist at the end of this story, when the man who tried to extinguish my light is forced to crawl to my doorstep begging for salvation, will give you a level of satisfaction you've never seen in any movie. My name is Patricia Hale. At 37, I have spent the better part of my life transforming from a girl with a local map and a bicycle into the top-tier real estate broker in Chicago, navigating the brutal high-stakes world of Midwest luxury listings. I built my empire on the ruins of a difficult divorce, turning my back on safety to prove that a woman standing alone could out-hustle any corporate firm in the city. The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of gold leaf and velvet, that night shimmering under the weight of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. As I walked toward the stage, the sound of my name echoing through the speakers felt like a symphony I had composed note by note. The standing ovation was deafening. I looked out over a sea of Chicago's elite men and women I had closed multi-million-dollar deals for, and for a fleeting moment I felt untouchable. My heart swelled with a pride so pure it brought a sting to my eyes. I reached the podium, my fingers grazing the cool, heavy glass of the Broker of the Year award, and I looked toward the front table where Daniel sat. Daniel was the picture of success himself, a rising star in the tech world with a jawline that seemed carved from granite and a smile that usually made me feel like the luckiest woman in the room. He was clapping, his eyes fixed on me, but as I stepped down from the stage and returned to our table, the warmth I expected wasn't there. He leaned in his hand, resting on the small of my back in a gesture that appeared supportive to anyone watching from a distance. But when his lips brushed my ear, the air turned to ice. "Stop performing, Patricia," he whispered, his voice dripping with a casual, devastating boredom. "You're just begging for attention, and it's frankly a little embarrassing." I froze. The champagne in my glass suddenly tasted like vinegar. I tried to laugh it off, thinking perhaps it was a joke in poor taste, but Daniel didn't smile. He simply turned back to the man seated next to him and began a conversation about his own startup's latest funding round, as if he hadn't just gutted me in the middle of my own victory. In the weeks that followed, the radiance of that night began to dim under the shadow of 1,000 small cuts. It was a subtle erosion of my spirit, a containment strategy executed with the precision of a master architect. When I would come home glowing from a record-breaking sale, Daniel wouldn't ask about the commission or the strategy I used. Instead, he would sigh and refer to my career as a commission hustle, a term that made my professional life sound like a desperate, gritty struggle rather than the sophisticated operation it was. He practiced what I would later learn was weaponized incompetence. If I had an important gala for a charity board I sat on, he would suddenly forget the date or claim he was too overwhelmed with his own real corporate responsibilities to attend. Yet when his tech circles held exclusive mixers for high-level investors, my presence was restricted. I remember one evening at a rooftop lounge in the West Loop, I saw a major venture capitalist I had been dying to meet. When I asked Daniel to introduce us, he squeezed my arm just a little too tight. "Let's not mix your little house-selling business with serious investment talk, honey," he said with a condescending pat on my hand. "You wouldn't want to be out of your depth." The atmosphere in our high-rise apartment became suffocating. I found myself checking my tone before I spoke, wondering if sharing my successes would trigger another one of his cold retreats. I was shrinking myself, tucking my vibrant personality into the corners of our life so that he could occupy the center. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, a decorated professional who felt like a fraud the moment I stepped through my front door. It wasn't until a Tuesday lunch with Linda that the fog began to lift. Linda was 62 and had seen the rise and fall of more empires than I could count. She sat across from me, her sharp eyes scanning my face as I tried to minimize Daniel's behavior. I told her he was just stressed that he wanted me to be grounded. Linda set her fork down with a deliberate clink and leaned across the table. Her voice was steady, seasoned with the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving the storms of life. "Patricia," she said, "a man who loves you doesn't compete with your light. He doesn't try to dim you so he can feel brighter. He isn't protecting you from being embarrassing. He is protecting his own fragile ego from the fact that you are outshining him." Her words felt like a splash of cold water. I wanted to defend him, to say she didn't understand our dynamic, but the truth was written in the exhaustion under my eyes. I realized then that I was a student in a very hard lesson one, where the curriculum was betrayal and the teacher was the man I intended to marry. That evening, Daniel insisted we take a selfie to celebrate our upcoming engagement anniversary. He held the phone up, flashing that dazzling, curated smile that the world loved. I leaned in, painting a practiced, joyful expression onto my face as the flash went off bright and blinding. But as the spots cleared from my vision and the light faded, I looked at his reflection in the darkened screen of the phone. I realized with a terrifying clarity that the man standing beside me wasn't my partner, my protector, or my friend. He was my most dangerous competitor, and he was already planning his next move to take me off the board entirely. The realization that Daniel was my competitor acted like a splash of ice water, snapping me out of the trance of his gaslighting and forcing my professional instincts back into high gear. I didn't cry and I didn't confront him. Instead, I felt a chilling, clinical clarity settle over me. That clarity was put to the test only 3 days later when the most significant deal of my year, a $14 million penthouse listing on Lakeshore Drive, collapsed in a single afternoon. My client, a tech mogul who valued discretion above all else, called me sounding frantic. He had received a tip that my internal brokerage data regarding the property's true valuation and a sensitive zoning dispute had been leaked to a local financial blog. The blog hadn't published yet, but the mere threat of a leak was enough for him to terminate our contract immediately. He didn't just fire me, he accused me of being careless. As I hung up the phone, my heart was thudding, but my mind was already tracing the digital breadcrumbs. I spent the next 6 hours doing my own forensic audit of the communication trail. What I found wasn't an accidental slip by an intern or a hack. The source of the leak was an encrypted file sent from a secure server owned by a boutique PR firm in the city, the very same firm Daniel had hired to handle his startup's Series A announcement. My breath hitched as the pieces began to click into place. This wasn't just a petty act of jealousy to ruin my afternoon. It was a calculated professional execution. Daniel wasn't just trying to make me feel small. He was systematically dismantling my independent pillars of support. He wanted me to lose this deal because without my own fortress of success, I would have no choice but to retreat into the safety of his shadow, becoming a dependent partner who followed his lead without question. He was clearing the path for a future where I was no longer a powerhouse, but a companion. Amidst this chaos, a new figure began to drift into our social periphery, Evelyn Hart. A woman in her early 50s with silver-spun hair and a reputation for being one of the most ruthless venture capitalists in the Midwest, Evelyn was exactly the kind of woman I had always aspired to be. However, Daniel's behavior around her was unsettling. He began inviting her to our private dinners, and during these evenings, he would engage in a subtle, sophisticated smear campaign against me right under my nose. He would look at Evelyn with a weary, practiced expression of paternal concern, describing me as brilliant but emotionally volatile. He would mention the stress of my career and how he was currently managing my chaotic environment to keep me focused. He was building a narrative that I was a liability, a woman who had reached her ceiling and was now cracking under the pressure. I watched Evelyn as he spoke. She was poised and observant, her expression unreadable behind her designer glasses. Initially, I felt a surge of territorial anger, assuming she was a potential mistress or a rival. But as I saw the way her eyes lingered on me when Daniel wasn't looking, I began to suspect something deeper. Daniel was using me as a foil to boost his own image. By portraying me as the brilliant but broken woman he was saving, he was positioning himself as the stable strategic protector, the kind of man an investor like Evelyn could trust with millions. He was selling my supposed instability to buy his own credibility. The most painful discovery, however, came from within my own office. Caroline Mills had been my right-hand woman for 5 years. I had mentored her, shared my client list with her, and trusted her with the keys to my professional kingdom. One morning, while Caroline was in a meeting, her desktop notification flashed with an incoming message from Daniel. My stomach turned as I felt a sudden, irresistible urge to look. I found a hidden folder in her sent items filled with forwarded context emails, confidential listing projections, internal commission structures, and private notes on my high-net-worth clients, all sent directly to Daniel's private address. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced myself to keep scrolling. The correspondence showed how Daniel had manipulated her playing on her loyalty to me. He had convinced Caroline that I was struggling mentally, that I was overwhelmed, and that he needed this data to help stabilize my business from the background without hurting my pride. He had weaponized Caroline's kindness against me, turning my most trusted ally into a spy. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic manipulation. I closed the laptop and walked back to my desk, my face a mask of professional calm. I didn't scream, and I didn't fire her on the spot. I knew that in the world of high-stakes real estate and tech, the one who reacts first loses. I began a secret log documenting every leak, every smear, and every betrayal. To fight a man who treated life like a game of chess, I had to stop playing the role of the queen and start acting like the grandmaster. The final blow to my heart and the ultimate ignition of my resolve came late that night. Daniel was soundly asleep, his breathing rhythmic and untroubled, the sleep of a man who believed he had already won. His leather briefcase was unlatched on the mahogany desk in his study. I moved through the shadows of our silent apartment, my fingers trembling as I reached inside. I expected to find more evidence of the PR firm's work, or perhaps letters to Evelyn. Instead, I pulled out a thick, legal-bound folder. It was a draft for a comprehensive merger and acquisition agreement, but it wasn't for his tech startup. It was a prenuptial and post-merger strategy document prepared by his attorneys. As I scanned the dense legal jargon, the blood drained from my face. The document outlined a plan to consolidate all of my personal real estate assets, my client database, and my future listing commissions into a new holding company that Daniel would majority own upon the signing of our marriage license. He wasn't planning a wedding, he was planning a hostile takeover. The proposal, the ring, the I love yous, they were nothing more than the closing conditions of a business deal. He didn't want a wife. He wanted my empire, and he had been orchestrating my professional failure just to ensure I would be desperate enough to sign his contract and hand him the keys. The discovery of that merger document felt like finding a cold, sharp blade tucked under my pillow. I didn't confront Daniel when he woke up the next morning. I watched him drink his coffee and talk about the synergy of our future, while I felt my own heart calcifying into something indestructible. 2 days later, I was sitting in the mahogany-lined office of Margaret Sloan. At 64, Margaret was the kind of attorney who had seen every trick in the book, a woman whose calm demeanor was a mask for a mind that functioned like a precision-engineered trap. She adjusted her glasses as she pored over the draft I had photographed from Daniel's briefcase. The silence in the room was heavy until she finally looked up, her expression a mix of professional admiration and maternal pity. She pointed to a section buried under a mountain of legalese titled Intellectual Property and Network Growth Attribution. Margaret explained that this wasn't just a standard prenuptial agreement. It was a surrender of my autonomy. The clause legally granted Daniel's tech firm the rights to my entire client database and the goodwill of my future listings the moment our marriage license was filed. The timing was the most damning part. Daniel had officially proposed just 14 days after I was named to the top 1%. He didn't want a life partner. He needed my industry-leading stats to secure his Series A funding. To his investors, my consistent high-value commissions were the collateral that made his startup look like a safe bet. I wasn't his fiancé, I was his security deposit. I felt a surge of nausea at the realization that my heart had been used as a line of credit, but Margaret didn't give me time to wallow. She leaned in her voice a low, steady hum of tactical brilliance. She told me that if I refused to sign, he would know I was on to him and he would accelerate his sabotage to destroy my reputation before I could leave. We had to play his game, but with a sharper set of rules. Margaret helped me draft a counterproposal that looked like a minor technicality to an arrogant man like Daniel. We inserted a specific execution and commencement clause stating that any data sharing or asset merging would only be legally valid and enforceable upon the actual legal commencement of the marriage. To Daniel, who was convinced he had me under his thumb, this appeared to be a standard protection of timing. He signed it with a smirk, thinking he had successfully trapped my empire. I signed it knowing with absolute certainty that I would never stand at the end of that aisle. It was the most empowering moment of my life, letting a narcissist believe he had won while I was quietly locking the door and taking the keys. The end came on a Tuesday evening at a quiet, dimly lit French bistro where the tables were spaced far enough apart for privacy but close enough for witnesses. I chose this place specifically because Daniel valued his public image too much to cause a scene. I waited until the main course was served before I slid the velvet box across the table. I didn't cry and I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him that we were no longer aligned and that the engagement was over. The look on his face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated shock, followed quickly by a sneer of cold contempt. He didn't ask why. His first instinct was to attack my value. He leaned over the table, his voice a harsh whisper telling me that I was making a catastrophic mistake. He mocked me, saying that without his stability and his network, my career would wither into nothingness. He predicted that I would be begging him for a job within 6 months once the real world realized I was nothing more than a lucky broker. I listened to his vitriol and felt nothing. I realized that his words only had power if I believed I was as small as he wanted me to be. I stood up, left my half of the bill in cash, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I stepped out into a sudden freezing Chicago rain, the wind whipping off the lake and stinging my face. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the water soak into my coat, and I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. My professional reputation was still under a cloud of his making, and I knew the next few months would be a brutal climb to rebuild what he had tried to leak away, but for the first time in years, I was breathing air that didn't belong to him. I was Patricia Hale again, and I was whole. The next 3 years were a blur of relentless work and strategic silence. I rebuilt my firm from the ground up, pivoting to an even more exclusive clientele and using the lessons I learned from Daniel's betrayal to protect my data like a fortress. I became more successful, more respected, and more powerful than I had ever been during our relationship. I had almost forgotten the sound of his voice until the morning a man in a dark suit showed up at my new office. He didn't have a listing for me. He showed me a gold badge and laid a thick, glossy pitch deck on my desk. It was Daniel's latest investor presentation for a multi-billion-dollar expansion. I opened the first page and felt my blood turn to liquid nitrogen. There, in high-resolution print, was my name, my face, and my proprietary financial forecasts listed as his lead strategic partner for a venture I had never even heard of. The federal agent, a man named Miller with eyes like flint, watched me as I turned the pages of Daniel's pitch deck. It was a surreal experience seeing my own professional identity hijacked and repurposed as a prop in a billionaire's fantasy. Agent Miller explained that the Securities and Exchange Commission had been quietly building a case against Daniel's tech conglomerate for months, focusing on a pattern of misrepresentation regarding secured strategic partnerships. Daniel hadn't just used my name. He had taken the proprietary forecasts, the confidential client letters, and the internal growth data from 3 years ago back when we were still together and photoshopped them into current documents to lure in massive institutional capital. He had presented me as his primary channel partner, implying that my high-net-worth real estate empire was the bedrock of his firm's stability. A cold smile touched my lips as I realized the brilliance of the trap Margaret and I had set 3 years prior. Because of that specific commencement clause in the prenup he had so arrogantly signed, Daniel never possessed the legal right to use a single byte of my data without a marriage certificate. By claiming me as a partner to secure his funding, he hadn't just been dishonest, he had committed federal securities fraud. He had turned his strategic move into a self-destruct sequence, and all I had to do was tell the truth. The following morning, I was summoned to a high-stakes meeting at a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Chicago River. I expected a room full of hostile lawyers, but instead I found Evelyn Hart sitting at the head of the table. She looked exactly as she had 3 years ago, poised, sharp, and utterly formidable. As the door clicked shut, the professional mask she usually wore softened into something resembling a conspiratorial grin. The Evelyn twist was a revelation that hit me with more force than the SEC investigation itself. Evelyn explained that she had never believed Daniel's volatile woman narrative. Years ago, after witnessing his behavior at our private dinners, she had reached out to me through a blind third-party channel. We had been sharing information through our lawyers for over 1,000 days. Evelyn hadn't invested $40 million in Daniel because she believed in his tech. She had invested in the evidence needed to systematically dismantle a man she recognized as a predatory narcissist. She had watched him use her name to lure other investors, all while she was quietly documenting his every lie. "I've seen men like Daniel my entire career," she said, her voice a low, resonant hum of solidarity. "They think women are just assets to be traded. I didn't want to just leave him Patricia. I wanted to ensure he could never do this to anyone else." We weren't rivals or strangers. We were an invisible alliance, two women from different generations who had used the narcissist's own arrogance to bind him in a legal net from which there was no escape. As the news of the SEC inquiry broke, the collapse of Daniel's mirror was spectacular and absolute. The social death of a narcissist is a quiet, chilling thing to behold. It wasn't just that his stock price plummeted. It was the way the world simply stopped returning his calls. The very tech circles he had once dominated turned their backs with a speed that was almost dizzying. High-level investors who had praised his vision only weeks before were now issuing press releases, distancing themselves from his unauthorized tactics. Even within my old circle, the fallout was devastating. Caroline Mills, the woman who had once forwarded my emails to him, was subpoenaed by the federal grand jury. When she finally saw the pitch decks, saw how Daniel had used the information she provided to commit a crime that now threatened her own career, she finally understood she had never been his confidant. She had been his pawn, a useful tool to be discarded the moment the gears began to grind. I watched from the sidelines as Daniel was unmasked in every circle that mattered to him. He wasn't in handcuffs yet, but in the world of Chicago's elite, being unreliable was a far worse sentence than being guilty. His carefully curated image as the stable genius protector had shattered, leaving behind nothing but a man who had lied to everyone he ever claimed to love. The luxury high-rise apartment we once shared was liquidated. His board of directors voted to remove him with cause, and the glossy magazines that once featured him on their covers were now writing exposés about the house of cards he had built. He was isolated, stripped of the power that had served as his armor, and left with the crushing weight of his own mediocrity. For 3 years I had lived with the shadow of his whispers, but now the world was finally hearing the truth. Yet a man like Daniel never accepts defeat without one final desperate attempt to reclaim control. It was a Tuesday, exactly 3 years to the day since I had walked out of that French bistro when my doorbell rang late in the evening. The rain was drumming against the windows, a rhythmic echo of the night I had finally found my freedom. I checked the security camera and felt a jolt of recognition that was more pity than fear. Standing there drenched and disheveled was the man who had once told me to stop performing. He looked smaller than I remembered, the sharp edges of his confidence dulled by the reality of his ruin. He wasn't there to apologize. He was there because he had run out of people to manipulate, and he was looking for the one thing he always assumed remained his by divine right: my loyalty. I opened the door just enough to let the hallway light spill over Daniel's face, but I didn't invite him in. He stood there, the expensive wool of his coat sodden and heavy-looking, like a man who had finally realized the world was no longer under his control. He didn't wait for me to speak. The words tumbled out of him in a frantic, desperate rush. He told me the SEC was closing in, that his board had frozen his assets, and that he was facing a total collapse unless I helped him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a backdated partnership agreement. He pleaded with me to sign it to testify that our merger had been active for years, claiming he had only used my data because he believed we were building a shared future. He even tried the old familiar tilt of his head, the one that used to make me feel cherished, as he whispered that everything he had done, every lie, every manipulation, was for us. It was the ultimate gaslighting performance. I let him finish watching the desperation flicker in his eyes before I reached onto the console table behind me and handed him a thin blue folder. Inside was the time-stamped revocation of my brand rights and a certified notice of professional separation, both filed and notarized the very morning I had returned his ring 3 years ago. I told him quite calmly that I had been 3 steps ahead of him since the moment I realized he was a predator, not a partner. I hadn't just left him. I had legally quarantined my life from his the second I walked out that door. The realization that he had been walking into a trap for 3 years made the color drain from his face until he looked like a ghost. The mask of the perfect protector didn't just crack then, it shattered into 1,000 ugly pieces. When he saw the dates on those documents, the feigned affection vanished, replaced by a snarling primal rage. He began to shout, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway, telling me that I was nothing without him. He claimed that the only reason I had any success was because of the drama he provided, that my performance on that stage 3 years ago was only possible because he was there to ground me. He called me ungrateful, a broker who didn't understand the complex world of tech and power. I waited for him to stop, my heart steady and my hands still. I didn't yell back. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped a saved audio file. The hallway was suddenly filled with his own voice, recorded through the microphone I was still wearing as I stepped off that stage 3 years prior. "Stop performing, Patricia. You're just begging for attention." The recording played in a loop, tinny but unmistakable. I looked him dead in the eye as the sound of his own contempt filled the space between us. I told him that I had stopped performing for him the very second he whispered those words. I explained that every success, every deal, and every milestone I had achieved in the 3 years since was my own unfiltered reality, while his entire life had become a hollow performance that was finally coming to an end. He stood there silenced by the echo of his own cruelty, realizing that the attention he had mocked was now the very thing destroying him in the eyes of the law. After he slunk away into the rain, I felt a different kind of obligation to settle. A few days later, I met Caroline Mills in a small, quiet park far from the prying eyes of the brokerage world. She looked broken, her eyes red-rimmed and her professional posture gone. She began to apologize, her voice trembling as she explained how Daniel had made her feel like she was protecting me by sharing my data, how he had convinced her I was losing my mind. I could have sued her. I could have made sure she never worked in real estate again. But looking at her, I saw a younger version of myself, someone who wanted to be helpful and was exploited for that very virtue. I reached out and took her hand, offering a mature, quiet closure that she clearly didn't expect. I told her that I forgave her not because what she did was right, but because I understood the predator who had manipulated her. I explained that Daniel's greatest skill was finding the kindness in women and turning it into a weapon. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of true empowerment. I showed her that a strong woman doesn't need to destroy another woman to prove her own power. We sat there in the silence of the afternoon, two women who had been used as pawns in a narcissist's game, finally breathing air that wasn't tainted by his influence. I walked back to my office feeling a profound sense of peace. The quiet exit was finally complete. I had faced the ghost of my past and found that it no longer had the power to haunt me. I was standing by my window watching the city lights of Chicago begin to twinkle against the twilight sky when my desk phone rang. It was the chairperson of the National Women in Leadership Gala, the same organization that had given me the award 3 years ago. Her voice was warm and filled with a new kind of respect. She told me that the board had been following the news of the SEC investigation and my instrumental role in upholding professional integrity. She didn't want to give me another award. She told me that for this year's gala, they wanted me back on that stage as the keynote speaker. They wanted me to tell the story of how I had refused to be diminished and how I had turned a whisper of humiliation into a roar of independence. As I hung up the phone, I realized the cycle was finally complete. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the one holding the microphone. As Daniel walks away into the dark, Patricia receives a call from the gala committee. They want her back on that stage, not as a recipient, but as the keynote speaker. The months following the SEC investigation felt like the slow, deliberate clearing of a stormy sky. While my own firm expanded into a new headquarters, a sun-drenched penthouse suite that overlooked the very heart of the city I had conquered, Daniel's world continued to shrink until it was barely a footnote in the business journals. There was no dramatic prison sentence, no cinematic explosion of his life. Instead, there was something far more poetic, the justice of reality. He was forced to settle the federal claims by liquidating nearly everything he owned, leaving him as a disgraced consultant operating out of a cramped windowless office in a suburban strip mall. He had become a man of shadows, a ghost of the prestige he once weaponized against me. Every time he opened a trade magazine or glanced at a billboard, he was forced to see my name associated with the largest deals in the Midwest. The revenge wasn't a jail cell, but the fact that he had to live with the very mediocrity he had tried so hard to project onto me. He had attempted to make me small so he could feel large, but in the end, the weight of his own fraud had crushed him into the insignificance he deserved. I was thriving in the light while he was left to count the pennies of a reputation he had squandered on arrogance. Returning to the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel for the National Women in Leadership Gala felt like walking into a memory that had been scrubbed clean. The gold leaf and crystal chandeliers were the same, but I was a different woman than the one who had stood here 3 years ago, trembling under a man's whispered contempt. As I walked toward the stage, there was no Daniel at the front table to pull at my confidence. In his place sat Evelyn Hart and Margaret Sloan, their presence a silent testament to the invisible alliance that had carried me through the darkness. When I reached the podium, the room fell into a respectful, expectant hush. I didn't talk about sales figures or market shares. I spoke about the courage to be large. I looked out at the hundreds of women, many of them my age, many who had spent decades shrinking themselves to fit into the spaces men had carved for them, and I told them that their brilliance was not a performance. I told them that when someone tells you that you are begging for attention, what they are really saying is that they are terrified of your reach. Your light isn't a plea, it is a beacon. As I spoke, I looked directly at the spot where Daniel had once sat and whispered those soul-crushing words. I waited for a flicker of the old pain, a ghost of the humiliation, but my heart remained perfectly steady. He no longer had the power to make my pulse quicken or my hands shake. He was just a man who had been outgrown by the very woman he thought he could contain. The evening ended not with a crowded after-party, but on the quiet private terrace of my home. Linda sat across from me, the Chicago skyline twinkling behind her like a million diamonds scattered on velvet. We shared a bottle of vintage wine, the kind I used to think I needed a reason to celebrate with. We didn't talk about Daniel, or the SEC, or the years of sabotage. We talked about the future, the mentorship program I was starting for young women in the industry, and the new listings that were taking me across the country. There was a profound sense of emotional superiority in that silence. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the downfall of my enemy. It was the fact that I had lived my life so well and built my soul so strong that the villain of my story had finally become nothing more than a footnote in a much grander narrative. I had stopped trying to prove him wrong and started simply being right. I was no longer defined by the man who tried to break me, but by the woman who had the wisdom to let him break himself. As I looked out over the lake, I felt a deep, resonant peace. The journey from that whispered insult to this keynote speech hadn't just been about professional success. It had been about reclaiming my right to occupy space in the world without apology. I had learned that you cannot fix a man who sees your light as a threat, but you can certainly use that light to find your own way out of the shadows. The applause from the gala was still echoing in my mind, but it didn't feel like a validation I was begging for anymore. It felt like the natural soundtrack to a life lived in full volume. I stood up feeling the cool night air on my skin and knew that the woman who had walked onto that stage 3 years ago would be so proud of the woman standing here now. This was the legacy of the light, not just surviving the darkness, but making sure it could never find a place to hide within you again. And this time, when the applause rose, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like home. I hope this journey of Patricia Hale serves as a powerful reminder to every woman watching that your success is never something you should have to apologize for. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt the cold chill of someone trying to dim your light just because they couldn't handle its glow, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. By joining our community, you are supporting stories that celebrate resilience, female empowerment, and the quiet strength it takes to walk away from a toxic narrative. We truly value your perspective and want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Patricia's quiet exit was the right move, or would you have confronted Daniel sooner? Have you ever had a mentor like Linda, or an unexpected ally like Evelyn, who helped you see the truth when you were trapped in the fog of gaslighting? Your stories and insights help others realize they are not alone in their struggles. Share your experiences and join the conversation as we continue to explore the complexities of human relationships and the ultimate triumph of the truth. Thank you for watching, for your loyalty, and for being part of a community that believes in standing tall.